Okay, here we go. Welcome back to the late night double feature picture show. I almost forgot the name of our show. I'm Al. That's Pete. Um, so I think the last time we met and were discussing the Slime People, we had determined that for our next film discussion, we were going to do It Conquered the World. Um, Pete actually held up the film and we previewed it, but we ran into some technical difficulties. Namely, I don't own it on physical media, which I didn't think was going to be a problem because I figured it's got to be available on some streaming platform. And I looked at every streaming platform available, and it's just not there. So at some point down the road, for sure, we will revisit It Conquered the World. But instead, today we have selected a classic in its own right, um, the Attack of the Crab Monsters. Yep, there it is. I actually have the same version. So on DVD, Attack of the Crab Monsters was released in 1957. It is a whopping 63 minutes long. Uh, but even though it has some brevity, it packs a lot of stuff into 63 minutes, and you'll see what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. I do want to say before we jump into the plot of the film and our observations that this movie was produced and directed by the legendary Roger Corman. Um, I have a few production notes here that we'll get into a little bit later. Um, but just a very basic plot. So at the very start of the film, you see a boatload, a rowboat full of scientists and soldiers coming aboard an island. I don't think they ever actually say where that island is located, but we're assuming the Pacific because it's been very close to some atomic hydrogen bomb testing. So basically, they're coming ashore because the team that was there prior to their arrival has disappeared. No contact, nobody knows where they are. So this team is kind of coming to see what happened to those folks. So that's kind of like the setup at the beginning of the movie. Now, it's called Attack of the Crab Monsters, and for a 1957 film, your assumption would be it's a bunch of people and some giant crabs, and it would be a straightforward, people running around and giant crabs chasing after them and eventually catching some of them and eating them. But kind of much more complicated than that. The person who wrote this film went in directions that kind of amazed me. Uh, so first and foremost, Pete, just I think it had probably been a little while since you had seen the film. It had been a little while since I had seen the film. Just like generally, what were your impressions having watched it after such a long time?
Yeah, it's pretty much the way I remembered it, except a couple things jumped out at me. Is that you know it's a small atoll in the Pacific Ocean, um, and even though one of the things that kind of jumps out at you as inconsistent is that even though there's giant crab monsters, that there's regular crabs there too. So the question is, with all this atomic testing going on, why didn't it affect all the crabs, just a couple of them?
Right.
There's only two giant crab monsters, and they dispatch one almost right away. The other one causes most of the trouble for the human cast.
Yeah, I had the same thought. So supposedly this island was awash in this fallout from these atomic tests. Yet, and you see these images of these regular sized normal land crabs, and only two grew to this incredible size. The other thing about it was why only the crabs? My assumption is there was like avian life and other creatures on the island, yet it only affected crabs and actually only two crabs. So, so as I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, it could have just been a straightforward couple of big crabs, some people, crabs chase people, snip, 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 munge them up, right? But it gets a little more involved than that. You want to talk about some of the things that the screenwriter had the crabs, gave them an ability to do certain things. You want to talk about a few of those things, Pete?
So the crabs when they go after the people, they don't to eat the people for sustenance, they kind of eat their heads. They cut their heads off and eat their heads, and kind of absorb the consciousness of the person's head, of the person whose head they've just eaten. And they can actually communicate telepathically with the fellow humans on the island. So it's like as you go along, people start to disappear one at a time, and the people that are left, hear the voices of their dead comrades, so they don't realize they're dead. But it's actually the crab monsters that are communicating, and they have to communicate through some object, inanimate or other object, in order to communicate with their colleagues. So a little bizarre.
Yeah, that part was puzzling to me. As wild as it is that these crabs actually absorb the essence of the people that they've eaten and are then able to telepathically communicate in their voice. As bizarre as that is, I wasn't quite sure why the screenwriter had the voice have to go through a specific item. So you'll notice during the film that in one of those scenes, in a scene where the crabs are communicating telepathically, there's a shot of the item that is being utilized in that moment to help the crab communicate. I think at one point it's like a gun that may have been dropped, or a flashlight, or certain things. So that didn't make a whole bunch of sense to me. But it's a B 1950s movie. And by the way, as Pete and I talk about this film and some of the things that we enjoyed about it and some of the things that seem a little goofy about it, what Roger Corman was the king of and why he had such a long career and is still, he's still with us in his mid 90s. I think he's like 96 or something like that. And still revered at this, is that he made these movies on a shoestring budget, uh, but they were profitable. So, as an example, Attack of the Crab Monsters was made for $70,000, and to the best of my knowledge, its box office was $1 million. So, I mean, that's quite a return on your investment. $70,000 and getting $1 million back. So, as we talk about the film and maybe give it a little grief at times, clearly Roger Corman knew what he was doing. One of the other things the crab monsters can do. So when our intrepid scientists and soldiers come on the island, they've brought dynamite with them. And I think the team that was there prior that has disappeared also had dynamite with them. Um, Not 100% sure I remember why the dynamite was there with them. But ultimately, what we discover is that the crab monsters are stealing the dynamite for their own purposes and using the dynamite to trigger earthquakes. That that part, So I think you'd have to use a lot more dynamite than the crabs have available to them to actually trigger an earthquake. But anyway, we'll go with it, right? It's part of the story. So my question is, right? I mean, if you take a look at the crab monsters, giant claws. How exactly were they handling the dynamite, and how exactly were they setting it off? Is a question.
You wouldn't think that the manual dexterity would be there in the giant crab claw to use a small stick of dynamite.
That's 100% correct. Um, so ultimately, what the crabs are really doing is they're using the dynamite to trigger the earthquakes, and little by little, this atoll, not a very big island to start with at all, through the earthquakes, it starts to crumble into the sea. So the island is getting smaller and smaller. So the space that the humans have to try and avoid the giant crabs is getting smaller and smaller. So at some level, the crab monsters are using dynamite to make it easier to get to their prey. Um, Although, you could argue that, the fact that they're able to dupe the humans by using the voice of the person who was most recently killed to draw them out seems to be pretty effective, right? They don't really do a ton of chasing of people in the film. People kind of come to them. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no. I think that I watched the movie a couple of times leading up to this broadcast, and I don't recall. There doesn't seem to be any like modus operandi for the crabs as to why they're doing this. It's just people are there, they cut their heads off and absorb their consciousness, but there doesn't seem to be any end game for them.
Yeah, that's true. It's not like the giant crabs are looking to take over the world. I mean, there's
Yeah.
two of them at the beginning, and one is killed, as you pointed out. So there's only one. So it's not like one giant crab is going to take over the world. So it's not 100% clear as to why they're doing this. Um, One thing I forgot to mention, and I'd like to point out. So you have this atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and there were scientists there before, and they all disappeared. Now, of course, when the second group of scientists and soldiers show up, it's a mystery as to what has occurred to them. But really quickly, you understand exactly what's occurred. The giant crabs have gotten them, right? But the interesting thing to me is when the second team arrives on the island, the place that they end up going to for shelter, it's not like a laboratory. It's a house.
It's
It's
just like a,
yeah, it's almost actually more than a cabin because it almost not really, but it's kind of like a Brady Bunch house, right? It's like of that era, and and there's not a lot of scientific equipment. And you got a living room, you got some bedrooms and things like that. So like who spent money to build a house on an atoll? It's a little bit of a mystery also. Uh, Pete, maybe just talk a little bit about the whole idea of how the crabs use the voice to lure these humans out, and how it almost seems like the humans are a little silly to be duped by this, because it seems like there are times where you would question, you know, why is that voice coming from outside?
yeah, the people are in the cabin and they hear the voice of one of their dead colleagues. Of course, they don't know the colleague's dead. I think he's still alive because they hear the voice. But they hear the voice of the dead colleague coming from outside, but it sounds as if they were standing right next to right next to one another. So why they are, um, why they don't say, "Hey, well, I'm not coming out there. Why don't you come in here?" Instead, the voice say, "Yes, come outside, meet me near the caves, and I'll show you what I have to show you." And they're easily fooled by that, which is kind of silly, as you mentioned. Um, and you're right. There's not a lab. There's no scientific uh, equipment in the house where they are. There's two scientists. There's a Russell Johnson, who you'll remember played the professor in uh,
Gilligan's Island.
Gilligan's Island. Yeah, Gilligan's Island. He's sort of like the gearhead among them. He's able to build a radio out of spare parts that he has around. But so it's for a scientific expedition. It doesn't seem like they came very well equipped to do whatever it is they thought they were going to do with whatever they thought they were going to find on the island. So um, it's kind of silly in that respect. But like you said earlier, Roger Corman has a track record for making profitable films that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And this follows right along those lines.
Yeah, so along the lines of what we're talking about, how easily duped these people are. So there's a scene earlier in the film where they're in the caves where the crab monsters are dwelling, like maybe four or five of them. And while they're in the caves looking for the crabs, or I'm not even 100% sure at that time if they realize that the crabs are there, but they're in the caves, and the crabs use dynamite to trigger an earthquake, and basically things start to fall from the ceiling, rocks and whatnot. And one of the scientists falls to the ground, and a boulder falls and basically severs his hand. And so they kind of like they get him out of there, and they get him back to the Brady Bunch house, and they wrap up his hand and they put him in bed, and he's basically suffering. He lost his hand, so at some point they give him something to help him sleep, and then in the middle of the night, and one of the things that we should point out is that you, as the audience member, know that what you're hearing is the crab voice of a in deceased person's sound, because it has an echo, right? So whereas when everybody else in the film is talking, they're talking normally, but when you're hearing a telepathic crab voice, it's echoey. So the gentleman's in bed with his missing hand, and he's awoken by the sound of, it's actually two soldiers they weren't allowed in the house. They were forced to stay in a tent on the beach. So they have been killed by the crab monsters. And you basically hear them from outside the house calling to him and saying that they've discovered one of their other mates in the cave, and could he come to them? And basically, any other person would be like, I'm in bed, I lost my hand, and these guys are calling me from outside. Why haven't they come into the house? Why haven't they come into the bedroom? And once I acknowledge that they're talking to me, why don't they wait outside for me? They say, oh, we'll meet you at the cave. So very kind of suspicious activity that that the humans kind of fall for. Also, Pete, I think you'll remember in the film, there's actually one scene where one of the crabs actually attacks the house. It's just two people in the house, the man and the woman, the romantic couple, and you hear like all this noise, and the gentleman goes into the room, and you basically hear the crabs. Basically, the crab roars, which I was unaware that a crab could actually make a roaring type sound. And then I think you might actually even see from off camera like the giant claw.
The claw, yeah.
Yeah, and the guy runs out of the room and closes the door really quickly, as if the door would save him if the crab really wanted to get at him. And there's no real explanation for that. At the end of the day, um, I think the suggestion once the crab goes away and the other party members arrive and they go into that room and everything's been destroyed, is that number one, the crab has destroyed their radio equipment, and number two, that it was kind of like looking for food, which seems like an odd explanation to me. So, um, so really quick, just touch on a couple of things about the film. So Pete already touched on the fact that Russell Johnson is one of the stars of this film. Of course, most famous for his role as the professor in Gilligan's Island. But Russell Johnson also had a history of appearing in some pretty good sci-fi horror films of that era, along with Attack of the Crab Monsters. He also appeared in It Came from Outer Space. He appeared in This Island Earth, and he also appeared in The Space Children. So, along with his role as a professor on Gilligan's Island, he was one to appear in these 50s and 60s horror sci-fi films. I mentioned earlier that the film was made for $70,000 and did about $1 million in box office. Um, it does have an interesting title sequence. Do you remember the title sequence, Pete, with the images, underwater images of like sea creatures?
Yeah,
Yeah. So there's some imagery to be. So as the titles run, there's some imagery on the screen, uh, animation of like these depicting undersea giant creatures, giant squid, and different things. Interestingly enough, no giant crabs in a film called Attack of the Crab Monsters. There were no giant crabs in the title sequence. I guess they wanted to save the reveal. Pete, do you want to just talk a little bit about the actual construction of the crab monsters? I mean, obviously a low budget film, giant crabs, only two of them, but I thought rendered pretty effectively.
yeah, they're pretty cool. Like, you either see them in the caves underneath the cave system that runs underneath the island, or coming out of the ocean. Um, but yeah, they're pretty well done for a low budget film, and it's to make a special effect on a scale that size, um, for that for that time period is pretty well done. Although the eyes kind of reminded me of human eyes, so it's a little weird there, because most crabs, they have those little eyes that are set deep within the shell, or their eyes are on stalks, but these crabs seem to have like human eyes.
Yeah, that's the eyes are interesting. There's actually a scene where one of the characters is actually trying to kind of sneak up on one of the. I think the one crab has already been killed. And just so you know, the way that crab was killed is that along with dynamite, they had some hand grenades with them, and at some point they began lobbing hand grenades at the crab monsters. The hand grenades themselves seem to have zero effect on the crab monsters, but is it a stalagmite or a stalactite that's on the ceiling pointing
I think it's a
down?
mite. I think it's a tight now. Tight comes
Tight
down.
stalactite. So the reason why the first crab is killed is that the stalactite is jarred loose by the explosion and basically pierces the crab and kills it. But so this one character is kind of like sneaking into the cave, and the crab is kind of like having a beauty nap, right, sleeping, because you can tell because its eyelids, very human eyelids, are closed. And while the guy is like stealthily kind of like coming up on the creature, you actually see like the eyelid like creep open a little bit as if to indicate the crab isn't really sleeping and is aware of the fact that this guy is in his lair and trying to do him harm. So, um, but yeah, generally I would agree with Pete. I mean, with for the $70,000 budget, the crabs are pretty well rendered. I mean, obviously in today's day and age with CGI and all that stuff, you make that crab look like a real crab, and these don't look like real crabs. but they're pretty effective. They're pretty interesting. So so we go through the film, and one by one, these people, soldiers and scientists, are picked off, and each time one of them is killed, the voice that the crab speaks with is kind of replaced by the latest victim's voice, right? Um, and little by little, the group is getting smaller and smaller until really it's our two leads, Russell Johnson, and I forgot to mention Richard Garland is also in this. Richard Garland, most famous for his role in Lassie. Um, Also, I didn't realize he died at a very young age. He passed away at only 41 years old. So, anyways, the two leads and the female scientist, who is the love interest of Richard Garland. I think there's a brief time there where Russell Johnson is like thinking about making time with her,
Yeah, he's thinking about making.
but she kind of like she seems slightly interested in one scene why she asks why he's asking about her availability, but then later she kind of shuts it down. So ultimately, the island now is getting smaller and smaller. There's only the three of them left. The crab has less area to kind of like chase after them. They're on some rocks, and on this one point, I guess it's like what is it, like a radio tower, that structure
Yeah,
that's standing up
yeah,
there.
satellite
Uh,
radio.
yeah, so they're kind of stuck, and the crab is coming out of the ocean, and they're lobbing hand grenades, and they're shooting at it, and nothing is effective. Take us through our heroic ending sequence there, Pete.
Yeah, so Russell Johnson. They do suggest earlier in the film that the crabs may be negatively affected by electricity.
Correct.
And so at the end, when they're kind of scrambling up to the top of what's left of this little island, where the radio tower is, and Russell Johnson gets the idea to kind of like create like a trap for the crabs, where he climbs up the radio tower and kind of brings it down with dynamite and grenades. I can't remember which one he uses. And then once the radio tower falls down on the crab and kind of electrocutes it, is the only way I can describe what happens to it. And that's and then the Richard Garland and Pamela Duncan, who are the only two left at this point, you know, are lauding his heroism. He gave his life to save them. Um, and the film pretty much ends there. But being as nobody ever made it back to wherever these people came from to let them know what was going on, it remains to be seen whether or not they're ever rescued from that island.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. Something I forgot to mention. So, um, when they're dropped off at the island, the scientists and the soldiers, there's a seaplane that has landed, and this is from which they disembarked on the boat to go to the island. And there's a scene after they've gotten all set up where a few of the soldiers are going back to the seaplane to take off to head back to the base, wherever that base might be. And that seaplane is taking off, and inexplicably, it blows up. Um, so I don't know what the suggestion is there. Is it just happenstance that it blew up? Is there a suggestion that one of the crabs, while they were on land, like put some dynamite on the ship and intentionally like sabotaged the airplane? That's not really clear. Also, forgot to mention too, um, within the first 2 minutes of the movie, you see this boat coming ashore. The passengers and the soldiers disembark. I guess the suggestion is that a couple of soldiers go back to the plane for some more provisions and come back. There's like three of them on the boat coming back. And as they're coming back towards the beach with the provisions, they kind of get broadside to the waves, and one of them falls into the water. Now they're literally like 4 feet from the shore. Yet
Yeah,
the soldier falls into the water. It looks like he falls into about 30 feet of water. He just
yeah, the water deep there.
so not only does he fall into like 30 feet of water, a few feet from the shore, but of course he falls right. The crab monster's right there. As we indicated, there's only two of them. So there's a crab monster right there, and basically it decapitates this guy, the soldier, and then they pull the body back up, and you see kind of like the thing you have to love about 50s and 60s B-grade horror films. You see like a bloodless, decapitated body. They pull the body up, like a part of his shirt has flapped over, so conveniently you don't see any like neck stump or gore. But anyway, so to Pete's point, yeah, so these two guys are alive. So Russell Johnson, for some reason, in his haste to try and kill this creature, takes a grenade and runs towards the crab. I'm not sure why he thought this was a good idea. And basically, the crab swipes at him with his mighty claw. And Russell Johnson drops the grenade, and the grenade goes off within a decent proximity of Russell Johnson, and his leg is injured. He's like bloodied, his pants are ripped. And at that point, he gets to the radio tower and pulls it down into Pete. As Pete indicated, kind of gives his life in saving his 2B. And the thing I love about what Pete was describing is that Russell Johnson does this. The crab basically liquefies. You don't see what happens to Russell Johnson, but you know he's dead. He's been electrocuted along with the crab. And they cut to the romantic leads, and they're hugging each other. And you know, she says, you know, he gave his life for us, and he says, I know. And then the end pops up on the screen. So as I said at the beginning, 63 minutes, but a lot going on. You know, two giant crabs decapitating people, able to speak in the telepathic voice of the dead, able to manipulate dynamite and trigger earthquakes, and little by little kind of like reduce the island until it was just them and a few humans. So a lot going on. And as I also said in the beginning, you know, this could easily just have been a giant crabs, people, and the crabs are just chasing the people around, but somehow they turned it into something much more. So we've reached that point in our videos where we're going to grade and discuss a little bit about how we felt about the film and grade it from an A to F as if we were in school, back in school. So, Pete, do you want to talk a little bit about your just overall thinking about the film and your grade?
Yeah, it's an enjoyable film to watch. It's I think helped by the fact that it only runs 63 minutes because um, there's not enough plot there for a longer film. I don't think.
No,
Um, and back to the ability of the crabs to use dynamite. You know, doesn't a stick of dynamite, at least in most older films, doesn't a stick of dynamite need to be lit with a match or something like that?
absolutely,
And
absolutely,
yeah, the crabs don't have any. They don't have any resources like that.
and
So
and
how
no
they
and no opposable thumbs.
right? No opposable thumbs. So how they actually light a match to in turn light a stick of dynamite is a little bit confusing. But um, yeah, it's a little bit nonsensical in the plot, but it is entertaining. The crab monsters themselves are effective special effects for the time and the budget that they had, that Roger Corman had to work with. So I'm going to give the movie a D plus. I've seen a lot worse, but I've seen a lot better.
Was that D as in David?
D is in David.
Okay, D plus. Um, so yeah, I would say about the film that yes, it's. I think you're right that if it had gone much longer than 63 minutes, it could have become tedious. I think 63 minutes is a good length for it. You know, the positives I would say is you know, some good acting. Um, uh, you know, Russell Johnson, a veteran of TV and film, and all the other actors were fine too. So some good acting. I think the special effects with the crab monsters were, you know, fairly well rendered. So yeah, I think that was pretty well done. Yeah, I think the weak point is probably um, is a little bit of the script, just in the sense of uh, little fantastical some of the things that these crab monsters are able to do, like and with no explanation. Like, why would a mutated crab be able to telepathically communicate with humans and that type of thing, and how would they be able to manipulate dynamite? I think I'd probably give it a C. So not that far off. You're at a D plus. I'm at a C. Um, if you have 63 minutes to kill, you know we are approaching. Today is the last day of September as we record this. We are approaching Halloween season, and you know for Pete and I, Halloween season is horror film season, so we tend to watch almost exclusively horror films. So if you're of a mind and you have a way to access it, I would say it's not the worst way to spend 63 minutes. Um, so, okay, let's talk about what we think we might review next. And hopefully we won't have a reoccurrence of what happened last week with It Conquered the World. You and Pete and I, prior to coming out to do the video, talked about a couple of potential films we could do. But I leave it to Pete from the films that we discussed to pick the one that we will discuss next.
So yeah, next week we've decided to, at least that's the plan as of right now, is to review the classic Horror of Party Beach, which is a Del Tenney production. Del Tenney, again, one of the masters of the 50s and 60s B horror, B sci-fi movies. This one's on a double feature. It's a Del Tenney double feature, so it's the Horror of Party Beach and the Curse of the Living Corpse, which is kind of an oxymoron, I guess. But we're gonna go with the Horror of Party Beach next. This one was made in 19. When was this one made anyway?
The early 60s?
1963.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it stars John Scott, Alice Lyon, Alan Laurel, Eula Bell Moore, Marilyn Clark, and Augustin Mayer. So if you sat up while I was saying that and said, "Holy cow, Austin Mayer's in that,"
Yeah.
you have a reason to watch the Horror Party Beach, and we'll certainly watch it and check in with you next week.
Yeah, not a bunch of those. It doesn't seem like many of those people went on to long Hollywood careers. There's so much, and we don't want to give it away. We'll save it for another video. But there's so much to talk about with that particular film, especially because it marries this idea of the kind of beach bingo kind of film with a horror film. There's actually a bunch of sequences where you have like a live band on the beach playing. So anyway, we will save that until next time. Until then, again, I'm Al. He's Pete. And thank you again for joining us for the late night double feature picture show. We will talk to you
Yeah.
next time.